What is up, Big Travy? What is up, Whisper Nation? We are back again. This time, we are talking those wide receiver ones that finished in 2020, if they can repeat in 2021. And if they can't, who are the guys that are going to replace those guys? We're going to talk about all that. And hey, why not a little bit of Russell Wilson talk? Because who can resist a little Russell Wilson talk at this point in the year? Let's get it right here on the Fantasy Whisperers.
Right here.
You are watching this, and you could do us a huge favor. Go ahead and hit that like button and share on whatever platform you are on. It really helps with the algorithms and helps grow our channel. If you know anything about social media, we are slaves to the algorithms, much like they were slaves in the Matrix to the machine. So please help us pull the plug and follow our dream. If you are new to the Fantasy Whispers, welcome in. We appreciate you joining us. Please consider hitting us up with a follow. We release fantasy football content daily. You can find us on our past shows on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Spotify. All you got to do is search the Fantasy Whispers or go to thefantasywhispers.com. We've got links and everything right there. But first, Johnny, you mentioned it at the top. Adam Schefter reporting earlier last week, Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson has not demanded a trade. His agent Mark Rodgers told ESPN, but Wilson has told the Seahawks he wants to play in Seattle. But, and there's always a but, if a trade were considered, the only teams he would go to are the Cowboys, Saints, Raiders, and Bears. So kind of giving a little bit of cheese to the Seahawks, saying, hey, if you were going to trade me to these teams. Otherwise, I have a no trade clause. Johnny, if traded, where do you think Russell Wilson would go and be the best fit?
I'm going to start the first question off by saying I do hope he gets traded, because as a Cardinals fan, I want him out of our division and I don't want to deal with him twice a year. But even on a fantasy impact level, right, it would be fun to see him be traded to another team and see what the potential is. And, obviously if that team is trading for Russell Wilson, they intend on letting Russell Wilson, quote unquote, cook, because that's what we all want in the fantasy community, right? Like, let Russell Wilson cook. On the other hand, do I think this will happen? That's the other big side of this whole question. The fantasy person in me really wants and thinks that this could happen because, I love to trade and I trade all the time. I probably hit you up, Big Travy, weekly for dynasty trades. So I from that standpoint, yeah, can't confirm. I really do hope this happens, but ultimately I just don't see it because of the salary cap and everything like that. You and I have talked off script here or off show about how likely it would be for the Seattle to be able to pull off a trade like this. And it's pretty difficult, cap wise. So I don't think this will happen. Unfortunately, it is fun to think about and, fantasize about, what other assets could be, upgraded if he were to get traded. But ultimately, I think he does stay in Seattle. And listen, this happens, right? Like, this isn't the first time that we have seen players get unhappy with their situation and say, hey, you need to fix this.
This offseason. Not the first time this offseason even.
Right.
Yeah. You make a lot of great points there, Johnny. Whisper Nation, we want to know what you think. Do you think Russell Wilson will get traded? Go ahead and comment in the comments below what you think about there. I like him going to the Saints, Johnny. If you're going to pick one of those teams on his wish list, I think the Saints are a great fit. Obviously, Sean Payton, the mastermind there, who has just done great things for offense in New Orleans for the past 10 years, however long he's been there. You look at the defense. Let's say they don't have to give up a lot of defensive pieces to go and acquire Russell Wilson. Maybe it's future picks. The defense is one that can rival any in the NFL, really, as far as putting pressure. They've got good back end help too within the secondary. And then you've got the weapons. If they're able to retain Kamara and Michael Thomas in this hypothetical deal for Russell Wilson, that's a great combo for him to go and dump the ball off to. I think that's the best of those situations that are listed out of the Cowboys, Saints, Raiders, and Bears. But Whisper Nation, let us know in the comments below which team you like best for Russell Wilson to end up to. But Johnny, now we're going to get into it here. We're talking the top 10 wide receivers from 2020 because we want to try and project who we think the number one wide receiver will be in 2021. And so in order to do so, we're going to go through the list because usually, especially at wide receiver position, you're going to get some of those repeat guys in the top 10, those guys that are main veins of their offense. And nobody was more of a main vein for their offense this year at the wide receiver position than Davante Adams. Guys, Davante Adams of the Green Bay Packers finished wide receiver 1 in many formats, maybe wide receiver 2, depending on your format, but mostly wide receiver 1. 115 receptions on 149 targets, 1,374 receiving yards, and 18 touchdowns. He also missed 2 games. So just incredible numbers. 30 red zone reception touchdowns. 30 red zone receiving touchdowns since 2018. That's 8 more than any other player in that span. Has 10 or more touchdowns in 4 of the last 5 seasons. You could see a situation where Green Bay could bring in or draft a wide receiver finally, but I still like Davante Adams, highest graded wide receiver versus single coverage since 2018, better than DeAndre Hopkins, who's not on that list. PFF gives him a 97.1 score against single coverage. That is elite. And I think, there's a really good shot that Davante Adams is right back at the top here coming next year.
Yeah, if they're going to bet on someone, right, like wide receiver, you're more likely to get a repeat candidate, right, from year to year. And Davante Adams, you did mention that Green Bay could finally bring in another free agent wide receiver, but they generally don't bring in free agents. It's just something that Green Bay generally doesn't do. And so, yeah, they hopefully will turn to the draft, but then you're looking at a rookie who could take some time to develop depending on which rookie that is. So, yeah, the sky is really still there for Davante Adams to meet those expectations because the situation's not really, no matter what happens, you can only say it's only going to get better, right? Like they bring in a rookie or they bring in a free agent. Well, all of a sudden, now he's going to get more one-on-one coverage. And we just said, or you just pointed out, that Davante Adams has the number 1 best highest graded coverage on one-on-one. So I'm really looking forward to what Green Bay does in the other, to go against Davante Adams on the other side. But I honestly, it's hard for me to see somebody else besides Davante Adams repeating as the wide receiver 1 next year.
And I think looking at the guy that's coming up number 2, Johnny, Tyreek Hill is a guy that I think could actually be number 1 as well. So, Johnny, why don't you break down a little bit what you see in Tyreek Hill, obviously on that elite offense, but what do you think? He finished as number 2 last year.
He had a mega year, right? A little bit of a down year the prior year before, had some injuries, but last year, 87 receptions on 135 targets, over 1,270 yards receiving. He had 15 receiving touchdowns, Travis, 17 total touchdowns. You got to remember they like to use the jet sweeps over there and get Tyreek, the ball out of the backfield as well. He is finished as a top 10 wide receiver 3 out of the last 4 years. And he is, chained to arguably the best quarterback in the NFL right now. He will be 27 years old at the start of next season, which is something to kind of monitor because speed is the first thing that generally does decline when players do get older. But I don't think he's quite at that, age yet. 27 is still pretty young, Travis. So I don't think we're at the age where we can start to see him diminish in his speed quite yet. But Tyreek Hill,
that's about the age my speed went out, was 27.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking about it, I think I had another year, maybe 28 for me, but I couldn't
Still
tell you the
running 4 or
exact
5s out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But as far as Tyreek Hill and repeating next year, obviously it's hard to say a player that is tied to Pat Mahomes, barring injury, a significant injury, isn't going to repeat as a top 10 wide receiver. Now, will he be number 2? Maybe. I think he would still have to get those receptions and he's getting the targets, but I'd like to see him haul in a couple more. But when you're getting deep bombs, it's kind of hard to get, that reception number up. But and 17 total touchdowns might be a little bit hard for him to repeat, but certainly a fun and electric player. Really looking forward to him and what he can do next year, Travis.
Hauled in 17 touchdowns, as Johnny just said. That's a lot of hauling in of the touchdowns. We want to haul in more likes and comments, so make sure you're commenting below, you're liking, subscribing to the channel. Help us out. The next wide receiver is one of my favorites to talk about just because I was so staunchly wrong on him this past offseason.
You weren't the only one, Big Travy.
Yeah, no. Stefon Diggs. And you know what? To be fair here, I was trying to root for Stefon Diggs, but you and Chelsea got on a podcast with me and talked me off the ledge with him. So Stefon Diggs, though, came in number 3 wide receiver in a monster year. Just got, they had this marriage with Josh Allen over in Buffalo, and it worked out so well. 127 receptions on 166 targets, 1,535 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. He's never had double-digit touchdowns in a season, so it's not like he's a big touchdown guy, but he got it done last year. Most total touches by a wide receiver in 2020. That's what you love to see. He had the most 20-yard catches. He has the most 20-plus yard catches since 2019. Well, second is Chris Godwin with 38. Stefon Diggs has 40. You talk about another mark that he's leading all other wide receivers in, receiving yardage leaders since 2015. Stefon Diggs, 1,535 yards. He's just continuing to dominate out there each and every year. And we thought that maybe going to a new team would have knocked him down a peg, but it actually catapulted him into the elite status we thought he could be. Because remember, Johnny, he was playing a lot of second fiddle with Adam Thielen there, and he was the big play guy, but we were just wondering, could he be the all-around threat? He was last year and then some. And I think he's a nice bargain guy to stay within the top 5. I know it's not really a bargain because he's in the top 5 now, but you're not going to be drafting him as the 5th wide receiver off the board. So I like that he's going to be a bit of a bargain for a guy who could easily get back in there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the one downside you would say, right, is you threw out the quote or the stat about the receiving yardage, and then you had never seen a wide receiver repeat, right? So 2015, Julio Jones had over 1,800 yards. T.Y. Hilton the next year, 1,448 yards receiving. Antonio Brown just over 1,500 yards. You see these guys, they don't repeat, and so one would say, okay, well, then we should automatically not think that Stefon Diggs can repeat this, that he is going to go down. And I would say, okay, let's presume his yardage maybe does go down a little bit. Maybe they bring in a little bit more offensive weapons or decide to run the ball and he doesn't get quite 166 targets, although I don't realistically see where he doesn't still get like a north of 150. But even if you were to say that were to come down, and I would not argue against that point, right? Well, you look at him, only 8 touchdowns, Travis, last year. I think that is pretty low, relative to what he can do. Once again, you said he has never had a double-digit touchdown season, but that's not to say that Stefon Diggs can't do that. And I think that even if his yardage does come down a little bit, I could see him next year getting into those double-digit touchdowns and really making up for that either way. So I think he's pretty safe for next year.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I want to talk about a guy who's probably just as safe, but way, just maybe even more tantalizing upside. That's Calvin Ridley, Johnny. I actually said I want to talk about him, but I want you to get in on there and talk a little bit more about Calvin Ridley and the monster year he had in 2020.
Yeah, so Calvin Ridley had a mega year. A lot of people were kind of on his bandwagon in the beginning of the season, saying that he was a sleeper. We were one of those people. We really liked his breakout. Even though Julio was there, we still said he has a talent and a knack for the end zone and getting receptions. He has a rapport with Matty Ice, and he sure did. He led that to 90 receptions on 143 targets. He had 1,374 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns, Travis. In 3 years of being pro, he has 10 touchdowns, 7 touchdowns, and 9 touchdowns in a season. He's only had 3 games all season, this past season, in which he had less than 12 fantasy points. And one of those games he didn't even play. So you kind of negate that and you say, okay, in 2 games in which he played, he scored less than 12 fantasy points. And then you look at what the situation is, right? Okay, I understand that Julio Jones wasn't in a lot of games. He was in and out of the lineup. They were dealing with a lot of last year as far as head coaching goes. Well, this offseason, they went out and brought in new head coach, and he will run the offense. His name is Arthur Smith. If the name sounds familiar, he was the offensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans, and we saw what he does to that offense and what he can do, and he has shown the ability to support 2 wide receivers, even with, one could argue Matthew Stafford and Matty Ice are pretty similar in talent wise, right? And so you would build the confidence. I think Calvin Ridley has a chance to either meet or possibly really break into that top 2 because he's always had the rapport in the touchdown area, and that's where you really need it. And now he's starting to get those targets and the receptions, Travis. I think Calvin Ridley is here to stay in this top 5.
Well, and a credit to Austin, who's co-host of the show. Obviously, you see him over there on our mock drafts, but he's been saying this for the last few mock drafts we've had, and we've seen that shift from Calvin Ridley over Julio Jones. Calvin seems to be the alpha, and obviously a lot of that was based on Julio's injuries, but Calvin seems to be a guy that scores touchdowns with Matt Ryan consistently, and that's not something that Julio Jones really has ever really done, and in a big way. Doesn't mean that they both can't feast, and I really like Calvin Ridley's prospects this year. DeAndre Hopkins came in at number 5, Johnny, from your Arizona Cardinals out there, and the big question for DeAndre last year, I remember coming into the season was, team wide receivers, similar to the Stefon Diggs story. Wide receivers who change teams tend to take a step back unless they're transcendent talents, which we have seen now with Stefon Diggs. We've seen it with Randy Moss. We've seen it with some other players in the past that have gone to different teams. Well, DeAndre Hopkins fit the mold of transcendent player and dominated last year. 115 receptions on 160 targets, 1,400 yards, and only 6 touchdowns. He's finished as a top 4 wide receiver 5 out of the last 6 years. And look, the 6th one would have been a top 4 if he could have just snuck into 4th. He was in 5th. Not bad. This will be his 2nd year with Kyler Murray. We do expect the Cardinals to draft another wide receiver, but I actually think that could help Hopkins, Johnny, because it could draw some coverage off of him. I really like what we saw with Hopkins' floor. The bottom line is you're going to get the target volume from him. You always have, no matter who the quarterback was in Houston, no matter who the quarterback will be in Arizona. Hopefully it's Kyler Murray, obviously. I mean, Hail Murray. We saw it last year. We saw DeAndre get up there and make a boss catch. He's got everything going for him. They've got this offense in a 3rd year under Cliff Kingsbury, a 2nd year for Hopkins and Murray to get together. I really like what I'm seeing. And Hopkins is, if Stefon Diggs is a bargain bet, I think Hopkins is probably your I don't even want to say dark horse. All these guys are good. I think that's the problem I'm getting at is I'm getting through all these guys and I'm saying, man, each one of these guys could easily be like flip a coin for me. I think DeAndre Hopkins is another case like that.
DeAndre Hopkins is interesting for sure when you see the development and him and Kyler get more on the same page. It could be frightening. I'm really excited for DeAndre Hopkins. Hey,
sound excited.
I was going to say, I know that, the Red Sea is very, very excited along with JJ Watt. So look out.
Yeah. Well, another guy that was causing a ton of excitement last year was Justin Jefferson, Johnny. And this was a guy who started slow. Like, we did not know if Jefferson was good at football because he just was not beating press coverage in camp, was getting a lot of smack talked on him by his coaching staff. Johnny, I want you to just go for it, man. Talk to me about Justin Jefferson here.
88 receptions on 125 targets for 1,400 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns, Travis. That was something we did not expect at all from Justin Jefferson. I mean, you just touched on the struggles that he had coming into camp, and he was buried in the depth chart even in the beginning. He was the 4th wide receiver. But then at the end, he ended up breaking out. He had the most 15-yard receptions among rookies. Justin Jefferson led with 35 of those. He's had a class that consisted of Jerry Jeudy, T. Higgins, CeeDee Lamb, and Jalen Reagor, and he was able to outshine all of those guys. Wide receivers with 7 games of 100-plus yards their rookie season since 1960. Check this out, Travis. OBJ is one wide receiver. The other one, Justin Jefferson. That's the end of the list. There's only 2 wide receivers that have had 7 games of 100-plus yards in their rookie season, and Justin Jefferson was one of them. And we have, we've
Jefferson
been
kind of remind you of OBJ a little bit. I mean, he's not exactly OBJ, both from LSU, both kind of undersized guys.
Both like to dance.
They started late. Obviously OBJ, they both do like to dance. Yeah. OBJ had the injury his rookie year. Jefferson was just kind of slow starter. They've got some eerie similarities. If you guys think so, comment below. Let us know what you think about that comparison there. But Johnny, keep breaking it down on Jefferson. I mean, this guy had a special 2020.
I mean, it didn't stop there, Travis, right? Like we could have stopped there and we would have said, wow, that was impressive enough. We don't need to go on, but we're the Fantasy Whisperers and we like to, because Justin Jefferson recorded a 76.4% success rate versus man coverage score in the reception perception last year. Shout out to Matt Harmon, who breaks that down. Through his history of breaking that down, only 4 receivers have cleared the 90th percentile in this metric. One was the guy we just talked about, Odell Beckham. Not a surprise that he would also be in this list. Number 2, Tyler Lockett. I was a little surprised on that one, but Tyler Lockett's up there. Number 3, also someone we talked about on this list already, and Calvin Ridley. And 4 is Justin Jefferson. So you're looking at that company of wide receivers. You're saying, all right, wow, this is very impressive once more. And then just to dive just a little bit further, Justin Jefferson also posted a 96th percentile score, 82.3% success rate versus press, according to the reception perception. 2014, Odell Beckham is the only rookie season that's higher. Justin Jefferson basically had OBJ's breakout rookie season last year, Travis, is what we're all boiling down to, and he just didn't get all the hype. And it was very curious to me. I went back and looked at where where OBJ went the year after his breakdown, and people were taking him as a top 5 wide receiver the year after he broke out. Well, the thing is, Justin Jefferson right now, in most of the mock drafts that we do on Monday nights, and if you haven't joined us yet, make sure you do hit that subscribe button so you can join us on the mock drafts. But I'll tell you what, Justin Jefferson isn't a top 5 wide receiver off the board. Because, as we're looking, we're in a lot of talent here, and a lot of people aren't sure if Justin Jefferson is the real deal. But based on the stats, I'm telling you he's the real deal, and you can kind of get him out of value, as weird as that sounds, as he's coming off as the 7th to 10th wide receiver off the board in mock drafts.
And how good is Justin Jefferson? He broke it down there. Johnny did. Success rate versus man, success rate versus press. If you want to be as good as Justin Jefferson, you better press, like, and subscribe, and follow us here at the Fantasy Whisperers. Yeah, best in the business.
Best in the business, baby.
Before we break down these next 3, Johnny, we've got next 4. If anybody is new to the channel, please hit subscribe. Please help us out. It helps grow the channel. We would appreciate it so much. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit, just very quickly, about DK Metcalf. Came in at 7 before I get in on Adam Thielen as well. DK Metcalf, the Seattle Seahawks, had 83 receptions on 129 targets, 1,303 yards, 10 touchdowns. Johnny, this was a story of him taking that step forward. We knew last year in his rookie year he had monster attributes. He was a athletic freak. We knew he could get it done. And then he and Russell Wilson together were on a world beater pace this offseason, or the beginning of the last season. Some struggles with that Seattle offense, and we'll see what happens with Russ Wilson. We talked about at the top of the show, if something goes amiss, that would affect DK. But I think Russ will be back. I think it'll be an opportunity for the both of them to kind of bounce back, fantasy-wise, regular season or regular football-wise. I think DK Metcalf's a fine pick to wind up in the top 5, jump his previous spot of 7 and maybe end up the number 1. I want to also talk about Adam Thielen, Johnny. He finished as number 8 in last year's ranking, 74 receptions on 108 targets, 925 receiving yards, but 14 touchdowns. There was a point in the season where he and Davante Adams were just jostling for position in receiving touchdowns because Kirk Cousins just loves throwing Thielen the ball. You talked about this on our mock draft. There's going to be a cliff for Adam Thielen. We just don't know when that will be. I don't want to bet on it right now. Top 10 wide receiver in 3 out of the last 4 seasons. Will be 31 by the time next season starts, so there's a little bit of doubt with age there. If he plays all 16 games last year, I think that he probably gets 1,000 receiving yards and he, maybe another touchdown. So you're looking at a situation where Thielen is locked in, at least chemistry-wise, with Cousins. Now, does something change at the quarterback position? We've talked about that speculation. We don't know, but if Kirk Cousins is there, sign me up for Adam Thielen. Last year, he was a great bargain wide receiver. You got great value on him. You'll get it again this year because people continue to doubt him. Johnny, it's now your turn. When we started to prep this show, you begged me to give you Tyler Lockett here. You had some things you wanted to say, get off your chest about Tyler Lockett. So number 9 coming in from last year's rankings, number 9 in 2020 was Tyler Lockett, Johnny. Take it away.
And I appreciate that. I definitely wanted to talk about Tyler Lockett. One, because frankly, I was a little surprised when I was writing out this list or going over the top 10 again. I thought that maybe the football sites that I had been checking had made a mistake and that the scores weren't right, because I just remember Tyler Lockett disappearing on a lot of games. And so I was like very surprised to see him as a top 9 wide receiver. But here we are. It's the real deal. It's the truth. It really happened. Tyler Lockett finished as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver last year. And Travis, looking at the numbers, it's hard to see why not, because he had 100 receptions on 132 targets. Kind of a surprise to see him get 132 targets when you're talking about him sharing the ball in the field with DK Metcalf, who deserves a lot of targets, right? He turned those 100 receptions into 1,054 receiving yards. Pretty good on the outside looking in. Had a whopping 10 touchdowns, Travis, that we talk about how touchdowns really bring up a player's total fantasy production score, and you're seeing a big reason right there. I wanted to talk about Tyler Lockett so much because when you break him down on the outside, you might say, oh my goodness, Tyler Lockett is a major steal. He's going later in drafts, so you might say, hey, that's a guy, why is he going so late in drafts? That's a sleeper, right? Well, it's kind of like fool's gold, right? He reminds me a lot, and Travis will know because we talk about it a lot on the show. And these kind of players drive me nuts, but I hate to say it. He's a lot like Amari Cooper, and that he gets the vast majority of his fantasy points from a few games. He is a very boom or bust type of player. If you look at what he did last year, right? He scored 215 fantasy points in total last year. 111.4 of those points came in just 4 games. That's 59% of his total fantasy production came in 4 games. The year he scored single-digit fantasy points in 10 out of 16 games in 2020. In 2019, when we look at that picture to see, hey, was it maybe just something that we saw last year and that was just a one year off thing? Well, no. In 2019, 50.9% of his total fantasy points, Travis, came in just 4 games. He did only have 6 single-digit fantasy games in 2019, so he was a little bit more consistent in 2019 than 2020, but if you look at his entire past, he paints this picture, and you know how I am with these players that are boom or bust. I rather go with something that's a little bit more consistent than a guy that's going to get me, the vast majority, because then I'm going to get frustrated. I'm not going to know when to play him, or I'm going to get frustrated when he has a good matchup and I play him and he does nothing. And so I would highly encourage a lot of people who have Tyler Lockett maybe in a dynasty. I'm going to give shout out and kudos to a good friend in our dynasty, Jeremy, traded away Tyler Lockett. I thought he was absolutely nuts when he did it, and he actually turned out he got a haul for it. And looking at the numbers, I think he did a good job because he sold them when at what I think Tyler Lockett's peak value is. And then if you're talking about if Russell Wilson does end up going and they end up getting another quarterback, that's scary. So, Tyler Lockett.
Well, I think most of your arguments there are great about the concentration of the points in the games that he plays. Mm-hmm. The Russell Wilson thing, I don't want to speculate too much on what's going to happen to Tyler Lockett if Russell Wilson goes, because I don't think he's going anywhere. But it's a great point you made there about the concentration of the points there. I do want to just shout out here a little bit of Peter Fondano, my buddy PJ over there on Facebook, who just gave us a follow. Appreciate the follow, buddy, on Facebook. Yes, appreciate he says, JJ Watt, let's go. Talking about that JJ Watt Watt news to Arizona. Yeah. So some not so nice things about the Packers. Says they stink. I didn't appreciate that one bit. And then he says that you have a sick Suns hat too, Johnny. So he's giving you some love on that Suns hat. He's out there in Phoenix as well. So I the that's why he's showing you some love. Big
no,
Phoenix
it's because fan. He realizes, and he's on the bandwagon, just like the rest of the world is about to notice. The Suns are putting people on notice.
Before I appreciate Peter in here, I appreciate Johnny, obviously my partner here. Before we get to number 10, I want to thank everybody who's watched and everybody who is new to the channel. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button or follow button on any platform you are. Help us grow this channel. Hit that like button and give us a comment who you like in the top 10, who you think is going to be the number 1 wide receiver for 2021. All right, our final number 10. from the top 10 rankings in 2020, Mike Evans. So Mike Evans, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, obviously 70 receptions on 109 targets, 1,006 receiving yards, and 13 touchdowns. Really heated up down the stretch, Johnny, because he had some up and down games through the beginning of the year, and he was not very easy to trust. You didn't know when. We thought, oh, maybe because Godwin was out, maybe because of these other things. But he did heat it up, and he has never had under 1,000 receiving yards in one single season in his career. He's only had double-digit touchdowns 3 times, though, in that 7-year career. So there's some things working here against Mike Evans. They'll probably be just as stacked next year as far as receiving options, but there are some things working in his favor. He's going to have Tom Brady back, and another year with Tom Brady means just even more chemistry. And it's not like Mike Evans is like coming off a cliff. And we know Tom Brady. I'm done doubting Tom Brady. You'll never get me on Mike. Like, he could throw 6 ducks in a row, and I'm still going with Tom Brady. I think Mike Evans is a situation where he's going to be a nice buy low guy coming into next year, because I think he's got room to grow here.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that people continue to doubt him, but once again, he has never had under 1,000 receiving yards in his career. I think that speaks for itself. That's the type of player that I like to have on my fantasy team.
All right. Well, as we did last week when we did the running backs, I want to mention a list of guys here, Johnny, that are honorable mentions / dark horses who could finish within the top 10. Michael Thomas, obviously not mentioned here, but a guy that always is within those top guys. Julio Jones, another guy. Allen Robinson, A.J. Brown, Robert Woods, Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, Amari Cooper, you mentioned him earlier, Terry McLaurin, Chris Godwin, Kenny Golladay, a couple rookies, Jamar Chase, Devonta Smith. Johnny, of these guys, you had a quick stat about getting into that top 10, and then I wanted you to talk about who you think is going to make it into that top 10 this year.
Yeah, so I was looking back on just the past couple of years, and you generally notice that 2 of the previous 10 years or previous years top 10 don't end up repeating as a top 10 wide receiver. 2 fall off either due to injury, or maybe it was a year that they just, had a really good season and they regressed the next year. So with that being said, Travis, I'm going to say that I think Tyler Lockett falls off this list. I don't think he is a top 10 wide receiver next year. And it's hard for me to say this, but and I don't like predicting these kind of things, but I do think I'm going to get off the bandwagon here for Adam Thielen. I think Justin Jefferson will take over and he'll be repeating, but I don't know if Kirk Cousins can once again repeat 2 top 10 wide receivers. So that's where I would go with the 2 guys that would fall off. And I'm going to do as my dark horse, Travis. I do ultimately think that Davante Adams repeats as the number 1 overall wide receiver, but I do think that my dark horse is A.J. Brown. He finally gets up there. He finally has a full healthy season and really bosses out. And I think that A.J. Brown he ends up being the surprise number 1 wide receiver next year. What do you think?
I don't think A.J. Brown's going to be the number 1 wide receiver. I think to fall out of the top 10, you did great work there. It's hard for me to pick anybody other than Tyler Lockett and Adam Thielen. I guess if you really wanted to make the case, you could say Calvin Ridley could fall out, because so much of his points have been based on touchdowns, and that can be a little fluky in fantasy. Mm-hmm. Plus, we could have a healthy Julio Jones the entire year, which could bring down the yardage for Calvin Ridley, bring down the usage. So I'll say, just for the sake of argument, that it's Calvin Ridley and Adam Thielen that drop out of this. And I'll say going into the top 10, I think Michael Thomas is a no-brainer to get back into the top 10. Yeah. And I'm going to go with Julio Jones as well. I'm going to go with Julio Jones getting back into the top 10. I have a lot of faith that Julio will come back, have a healthy season. If you look at some of the stats from guys as they aged, Terrell Owens, Randy Moss, Andre Johnson, some of these guys as they aged were still putting up great numbers as long as they played the games they were in. And I think that's all Julio's got to do is suit up, and he's guaranteed 100 yards like that. So for me, I'm going to take Julio and Michael Thomas and put them back in the top 10, pull those 2 out that I said there. But Whisper Nation, we want to know what you think. Make sure in the comments below you're telling us who you think will fall out of the top 10, who will make it into the top 10, and of course, who will be the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy in 2021. Johnny, any final thoughts for today's show?
Yes, my final thoughts for today's show, because I know you're trying to skim over it. shout out to my boys, Phoenix Suns. They whooped up on those Lakers. Shout out to them without Devin Booker. That was a little trash. But it's good to see that the Suns are finally back, and it's fun to have the rivalry with the Lakers.
Look, I don't want to take anything away from the Suns, so I won't. I won't mention that Anthony Davis was not playing and that we're not at full strength. I won't mention any of those things there. I won't mention that Kyle Kuzma wasn't playing in that game. I won't mention that Marc Gasol was out as well. I won't do that. I will just say congrats to the Suns for finally getting a win over the Lakers. That's nice. But we're not worried about games in March, Johnny. We're worried about games in the summertime. So come back at me with that same energy if we meet in the playoffs, and we'll just have to see about that. But I honestly am, all kidding aside, the Suns have been an exciting story, along with Joel Embiid, along with the Utah Jazz and God, now I blanked. I can't believe Donovan Mitchell. Almost called him Devonta Smith. We're crossing sports over here.
Crossing sports.
But I think a little NBA talk was fun here at the end. For Johnny Game Time Hicks, I'm Big Travy. We're the Fantasy Whispers. We'll see you next time. We're out. Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Whisperers podcast. You can hear more from John and Travis on Google Play, SoundCloud, and iTunes. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at TF